Hello, everyone. Question for you. Who else is building two-factor authentication or thinking about building? Maybe also side projects count? Yeah, oh wow, yeah, that's pretty great. So today, I would like to share with you my journey of building and then deploying two-factor authentication at Pinterest. And this was about 2.5 years ago. Pinterest at that time had 200 million monthly active users. So if you imagine, like, working on just that problem for a few months, and on that scale, I got really, really passionate about the topic of two-factor authentication. And I started following the trends, especially security keys. And when I say really passionate, I literally mean it. So with a group of friends, we started manufacturing hardware security keys. This is called solo keys. And what's cool about that is that it's completely open source, hardware and firmware. And by the way, tomorrow we are launching a new product. It's a tiny security key. Sorry if you don't see it, but it's by design, should be tiny. And it's called SOMU, S-O-M-U, and yeah, please check it out. But so today, let's go back to Pinterest and two-factor authentication. And so I would like to go through the journey and start by the design, and then focus on the two major flows, the user flows of login with two-factor authentication, and before that, probably enabling two-factor authentication, and then some of the details and the learning experiences. So just so we all have the same terminology, by two-factor authentication, I mean an authentication method where the user is granted access after she presents two or more pieces of evidence. And of course, from a security perspective, two-factor authentication will protect the user against attacks, particularly account takeover and theft of credentials. Vice versa, we know that every extra step in the login flow may lock people out. So as a security engineer, I definitely want to work closely with my growth team for metrics and with my support team because they are going to be the one handling user complaints. When we talk about authentication methods, we all know, something you have, something you are. So I want to review that very quickly by considering what's the first factor, what's the second factor, and so on. So in the first factor, we typically have username and password as the something you know. And then many websites, including Pinterest, have the login with other social networks, for example, with Facebook or with Google. And so those are the OAuth authentication. And so those, to me, represent something you have, meaning you have another account in another social network. Some people also, some companies like Slack is a good example. They log you in via a link sent to via email. And again, an example of owning another account. When we talk about the second factor, there are codes. Codes can be sent via SMS, or they can be stored in your Google Authenticator or similar app. The reason I put the codes kind of in between something you have and something you know is because for at least a little amount of time, the user needs to remember the code in order to type it from one location to your app. And because of that, essentially, the code should be short enough, and the code, like the password, can be phishable. So if we want stronger mechanism for two-factor authentication, we can look at something like push notification or security keys. And you may notice I didn't actually put anything about something you are, but we know there are technology like fingerprint or Face ID on your phone. So the reason I didn't put them here is because these biometrics are client only, so they are never sent to servers. They should never be sent to servers. And so from my perspective of building 2FA at Pinterest, there is no server challenge, so I'm not considering those in the 2FA. So today I'm going to focus specifically, or I'm going to pretend, let's say, that the site that we are starting with has username and password, and we want to add codes for two-factor authentication. And so now let's start with the design and think about what do we have to do in order to build 2FA. So the first thing we know, there are going to be two flows, one login and one to enable. And the thing to consider, for example, at Pinterest, these were two completely different locations in the website, in the apps. So they have two different teams owning the experiences. And so maybe there is going to be a complexity also in your company because you have to interact with different teams to make the two flows happen. Of course, you're going to modify backends and API. Clients, we have web and mobile application. Good news, well, of course, you have to build a login everywhere because otherwise you're going to lock your user out. But good news, you can maybe select only one surface where you want to implement enable. For us, it was web. Other companies like Instagram, I think they started mobile first. Then, at a large company, at least, or where the user experience is important, I highly recommend to interact with your design team, and if you plan to go international, also with your international team. And finally, because of the size of the project, we're going to talk very quickly about marketing and PR so that your final work can be recognized somehow. So this is a high-level view of what we will have to touch. So on your left, I guess, yeah, on your left we have a user service. However, this is implemented in your company. There is going to be an API and some clients. And all of the three will need to be modified somehow. We'll look at the details very soon. And then there is going to be a new microservice, or could be functionality, that is going to be the service responsible for the two-factor authentication, so for generating codes, for verifying codes, etc. At Pinterest, if we go again left to right, we have our user services, so backend services, we typically have Java Thrift services, database is MySQL. In the middle, the API is a Python stack. And on the right, we have React for web, iOS and Android, of course, with their own languages. So it's kind of a good number of languages to touch just for a project. And so my personal choice has been to delegate everything in two-factor authentication to Authy by Twilio. So now I want to go a little bit into the details of how we are going to build the login flow. So if I had to go back in time and build two-factor authentication again, definitely I would start from logging. Of course, I did the opposite. So the reason is probably evident to everyone here, is that login must be implemented in all the platforms. And if any of those platforms is delayed for whatever reason, the entire project gets delayed. So from a login's perspective, we have chosen to only build codes. This way, we kind of simplify a little bit the experience, and we have only one screen to build in all the application. And you see an example of the picture. So, but because we were using Authy, we actually have two experiences sort of automatically built. On the left side, we have the SMS. So for regular users, they don't even know we are using Authy on the back. And so they will receive a text, and they will have to type the code. For users that have already Authy, to the contrary, or decide to install Authy, they will receive a push notification that gets them to the Authy app. They can grab the code and go back, copy the code from Authy, and paste it back in the Pinterest app. So this, in a sense, requires an external app, And so some people kind of, I don't know, are not super happy about that. In our case, this was actually pretty good, at least in my opinion, because Pinterest, as any other social or alike apps, we tend to have a heavy use of our own push notification for growth and engagement purposes. And so many users, especially the one that want two-factor authentication, they tend to turn off the other notifications. So having a completely distinct way to notify user for security versus for engagement is also a good point. So now it's time to build 2FA, so there are going to be changes in the API. So the first part, we have already a login endpoint where we used to log in the user with username and password, for example. So in this case, the client sends credential to the API, and the API may check with the user service if the user has 2FA enabled. If the user has 2FA enabled, the API will block the return an exception or an error to the client, like 2FA required, and in parallel, it will send to the 2FA service to send the user a code, and the code will be delivered to the client. Then we have to build a new API endpoint. Can be the same one with different parameters, but for simplicity, let's assume it's a new one. So the client is going to send the code to API, which is going to interact with the user with the 2FA service to verify the code and return success or fail to the client. So pretty straightforward. So essentially, let's go back and see what we have to do on the back end and on the front end. So the back end, we have a current login endpoint, and we just have to throw an exception. And on the new login endpoint, it's just a new login endpoint that verifies the token. So it's kind of a pretty regular job for a backend developer or an API developer. On the front-end side, we said already we have built a single screen, and that's the easy part. What we found difficult, at Pinterest at least, was to catch this exception and to display the screen when it was the right time. The reason is that the network stack is something that was written who knows when, and of course nobody touches, especially the new front-end engineers. And so that was like a part that had complexities intrinsically built in it. And yeah, it was essentially harder than expected, at least in some platforms. So for the rollout, at Pinterest, we typically release every single feature as an experiment, and then we can roll it out progressively to users. It's highly, highly recommended, especially in these cases where we touch something so critical like the login. And one good thing to do if your company is big enough, well, even if it's small, but you get the benefit if it's bigger, to test with the employees, so you can have automatically people test it. So I put out check for unexpected regression because that's what actually happened at Pinterest. So with the Android implementation, even though user didn't have access to 2FA, they couldn't really set it up. So there was just a new code for the login. But this new code was interacting unexpectedly with the Facebook login flow, and so it was causing drop in logins. Okay, so thankfully, as I mentioned, we were gating the code with an experiment, so server side we could disable the experiment. But as you imagine, this was a slowdown in the process because we had to wait for the next release of the Pinterest app. So now that we talked about the login, I want to talk about the enable. This, in my opinion, has been simpler, let's say. We have to build a flow to enable two-factor authentication, and we chose to build it only on web. So the tip here is there are several many little details that can cause a lot of waste of time. So if you build it yourself, you can probably keep the pace of your project. But if you have someone else building, I highly recommend to get ahead of these decisions and help the people like not wasting time. For example, how do you format a phone number? Or which is the list of the country codes that you want to support, right? So these are really simple decisions, but if you leave someone unexperienced doing those, it may take extra time, and that's not really valuable work. So we have to implement two flows, essentially. One is to enable, and one is to disable. It's important to verify the password as a first step. This is because you don't want someone to sort of enabling 2FA or setting up a phone number for a user without their knowledge or consent. Well, then you have, of course, the input and the verification of the phone number, and that's exactly the same API call that you do for the login, so straightforward. And usually you want to have a fallback. In our case, we had generated backup codes, which is pretty standard in the industry. They are not really used by anyone, but at least it's not on you if the user loses the phone number. The disable, similarly, you want to probably verify the password. Some people, security-minded, may say, do you have to verify also 2FA before disabling 2FA? So looking around at other implementation, nobody was doing that, and I think one of the reasons is that the user may have lost the 2FA, and so you don't want those kind of users to bug your support. They can just disable 2FA. And finally, it's important that this disabled, there is no override, no way, even for your support team, to disable 2FA for a user, because an attacker may contact your support and try to trick them into releasing access to a user account. So for that, Auth is also a very good solution because they can handle that process for you, and you don't have to train your own support team. So a couple of details on enabling and disabling. Send security emails to the user, let them know that a phone number and two-factor authentication has been added to the account or removed, so that if it wasn't them, they know and they can react. Can a user have multiple phone numbers? I don't know. This is your choice. In our case, one phone number for one user. So in particular, if I'm setting my phone number to a second account, the first account will be removed. And this is a choice that also Facebook did, so I think it's a pretty solid one. When you roll out, my recommendation is to test internationally. Like I literally called my friends in Italy and asked them to try so we could see if the text in Italian made sense. And then even if it's a big launch, and for you it's been several months, if something goes wrong, it's going to be user logged out. So my recommendation is roll it out slowly, take your time, and don't rush it because a mistake can be painful. All right, so we have seen the two major flows, login and enabling, and then let's talk about some juicy details. And in particular, I want to talk about social logins, security keys, bugs, and something about marketing. So in order to understand like the philosophy about what we want to protect and not with 2FA, so we kind of came up with this rule, like a general rule in a sense, that 2FA is a contract with the user. So if the user enables 2FA, we, as Pinterest, have the obligation to never let that account be taken over from an attacker. So to the question, what are the other flows aside from username and password that we want to protect? Well, the answer is everything that generates an access token. So if we go back to the definition, the user has to provide 2 pieces of evidence every time he wants access to Pinterest. So I literally grabbed the code for every place where we were generating an access token. And of course, there are password reset. I also found some flows that were deprecated. For example, we used to have an API for Twitter authentication. And so we protected that, even though today there is no way to log in via Twitter for many of our clients. And this brings the question about the social login. So should we protect or not login with Facebook, login with Google, with two-factor authentication? And in our case, the answer was yes, again, for this contract that we have with the users. And there was also a sort of user experience reason behind that. The reason is that, think about the user. He's going to enable 2FA, and then he's going to say, oh, I want to try it. And so immediately they are going to log out and log back in. And we cannot really predict how they are going to log in. And maybe they choose Facebook or Google just because it's more convenient. And so in that particular moment, they really want to see the 2FA working. And so let's say both for security and for this, if you want, user experience reason, we chose to protect all the accounts, all the login flows. Security keys. So someone on Twitter commented, how comes that you manufacture security keys, but Pinterest doesn't have security keys? I'm sorry. So there is a new standard called 5.2, and WebAuthn is now a web standard since March. It's almost implemented in every single browser, including Safari from the new Catalina. So it's going to be really accessible everywhere for web. On mobile, we still don't know. Well, of course, Android works perfectly, and iOS is what we don't know. But it's a great opportunity, a great time for, get also advertising about like participating in a new technology. So a couple of needs. So if you decide to implement security keys, I highly recommend to support multiple keys so a user can enable a primary key and a backup key. And you probably also want any of the fallback methods. So if you look at the Facebook implementation, for example, they force user to also have either an app or a text message in addition to security keys. It's probably, in a sense, reducing the security, but at the same time, for customer support reasons, I think, as of today, it's really, really important. So bugs. So this is, as I mentioned, we released that a couple of years ago, so we had some time to go through, to experience two-factor authentication in production for quite some time. So what happened in this time? So on the enable-disable flow, to be honest, we've never seen any bug. On the login itself, we had a few. The reason is not a security reason, so we never had a problem where there was a bypass of two-factor authentication, like a new login flow where two-factor authentication was not present. The issues were mostly about showing the 2FA screen to users. At the end of the day, this was simply an educational problem, meaning that new developers were joining the front-end teams, the growth team. They were experimenting with new technology or new optimization of the login flow. They didn't know about 2FA, or they weren't trained enough, and so they didn't really think about, oh, there should be a case, or I should test also the 2FA flow. So the solution was pretty simple. We sat in a room and we went through an education, and so I think now my sort of learning is that periodically I should meet with the growth team, and especially with new people. And finally, marketing. So this was a big project, and it will be for you as well. So I think it's good to get the right recognition. So there is some marketing that you can do internally, and some that you can do externally. Internally, showcase. At Pinterest, for example, every Friday we have Q&A with the founders, and then we have a 1-minute demo where everybody can show the latest and greatest at Pinterest. So when we built 2FA, of course, we showcased it. And then I did personally a couple of extra meetings, a little bit more detailed for engineers or for people that wanted to know more. And then also enabling 2FA, as I mentioned before, test it with employees, but try to find a way so that they actually use it every single day. And actually, I'm very proud to say that our founder, Ben, has 2FA enabled on his Pinterest account, which is a pretty good example. And so for the external marketing, well, of course, you can always write a tech blog post, so that's on you. I don't know how it works on your company, but in ours, they are very happy when we contribute, so it's usually the opposite problem, that they cannot find enough people to write. In our case, because we launch internationally, and because our user base is also not very so tech savvy, we kind of did a company blog post as well to educate the user. So I've been working with the marketing team, let's say the less technical marketing team, and that was a very interesting experience because you learn how to essentially express complex, if you want, security things to people that are not technical. And in our case, we also translated in multiple languages, so I did the Italian myself, but for other languages, of course, it was a collaboration. And finally, the PR. Again, 2FA today, unfortunately, is not really big news. So PR, 2FA alone may not be sufficient to go PR, but it's always a good opportunity. So what we did was combining 2FA, the big launch of 2FA, with another or two features that we had released already about security, and sort of package everything together under this umbrella about account security. I mentioned before deploy slowly, so if you search, for example, for Pinterest 2FA, you'll see a couple of articles. One good way to do PR is not to say Pinterest is launching 2FA, but Pinterest is starting to roll out 2FA internationally, or 2 million of users, or whatever it does. So that's a good way, and if you go back in time, you look at, I don't know, Facebook, Google, they all did the same. So that's a good approach to take your pace. So this is a slide that I copied from my very first internal presentation. It's just to show you how many people have been contributing. There are a couple of Easter eggs like Authy, number 3, and also my wife in the middle, but of course they contributed. And yeah, as you can imagine, many more people have been helping after that. So in conclusion, I hope I convinced you that you can build 2FA. It's a pretty solid project, but it's one that can reward you. Login may give you a little bit of a headache with those kind of problems that we have described, but the enabling, disabling should be pretty smooth. And so now it's on you. So I hope you can build 2FA, and please let me know how it goes. Thank you. So the question is, how long did it take to deploy 2FA? From when we start to the end, it's like turning on the switch was about 6 months. And then we took probably 3 months to roll out slowly. Yep.
Have you had to deal with, and I assume a fair chunk of your audience is not very tech savvy.
Yep.
Have you had to deal with people that just don't have cell phones?
So the question is if we had to deal with people that don't have a cell phone. So actually no, and this is, yeah, this is probably just because 2FA is only on web and it's only on the settings, so you kind of have to search for that. And we are not really pushing to user, please enable 2FA. And so I guess it's never been an issue so far. Thank you. Yep.
Is there any like a performance issue with this
So yeah, so the question is performance issues. I would say no, because the login flow is not a very, so it's an API that, yeah, it's used, but it's not like super heavy. In the sense that people tend to be logged in and they don't constantly log in, especially on mobile. And so, yeah, even if the login process itself is a little bit slow. It doesn't really impact a lot. Yeah.
I missed the end of your talk. You guys are using Authy or your own stuff?
So the question is, if we use Authy or anything custom, we 100% use Authy today.
Got it. And so I was looking at the pricing. Is it really 9 cents per login, or I'm assuming you guys have negotiated better than that?
So the question about the price, so we have negotiated a price. So to be honest with you, I don't know what it comes down to per user. The thing is, when I was choosing and analyzing the market, I couldn't really find anything else that could have worked the scale, because cents is one thing, but dollars, like for example, well, I don't want to name, but let's say other companies, you pay per dollar, dollars per user, and of course, in our case, it's no from the start. Okay, thank you.